I already gave you guys a little bit of a demo here, but today I will walk you through a little project I've been working on, off and on for a while here, and it still is just a gist on GitHub. I'd like to make it an actual, or I probably will after this talk, make it an actual Git repository to kind of encourage contribution and get other people to jump on. But give you a little bit of background about why I'm hunting is I was running into a problem where I can script some awesome stuff for my admin tools or whatever, but handing it off to people is a little bit tricky because I either have to give them access to my system, I have to give them my level of permission, or I have to set up an actual web, like a large web server and kind of call the PowerShell scripts from my IIS. I looked at that option. But basically, I like building user interfaces in HTML. I don't know about you guys, whether or not you like the WPF. I have done quite a bit with that, but building PowerShell in HTML, building PowerShell user interfaces in HTML is like, I love it. Because the user interface, I did HTAs, I tinkered around with HTML. There's just, for the user interface, there's tons of CSS frameworks and JavaScript frameworks out there that you just Google what you want to do, source it in, and you've got like this pretty looking UI that makes it look like you know what you're doing. So I wanted to make user interfaces for PowerShell in HTML, and I searched forever and ever and ever to find a good solution. There's quite a few out there, and there's even a couple out there now that actually use for making client-side apps, HTML, a Node.js server, and an embedded Chromium browser, which is the new hotness for making desktop apps. There's a few different frameworks out there for doing that, where you're like, it's all packaged. You get a browser, a web server, and everything, but it's all running client-side. But I didn't necessarily want to mess with that, and then when you're making desktop apps or scripts, you gotta worry about distribution, so it'd be really nice to make it on a web server, but I hate IIS. Setting that up is like a lot of work. And so I came across, anyway, this really nice .NET web server. So I was looking at .NET web server, I can PowerShell that. So I came across Nancy, which I really like their syntax here. It is super simple, right? So this is all you really need to make a web server. So you import the module, you tell it the HTTP method, which is just GET, which is what your web browser does. Every time it goes to a page, it calls a GET request. And what do I want to respond with? It's hello world. So, and there is a module out there, Flancy, a micro web framework for PowerShell, which took Nancy and made it into a PowerShell module. So he's got some pretty good syntax there, and it's really easy to use. Import module, do a URL, and get. So I spun it up and I was playing with it, and it doesn't adhere to PowerShell syntax there. You see, it's just get and whatever. So there's another one out there. I was trying to find before this, but I couldn't find it. That basically wrapped Nancy and put it in PowerShell compliant syntax with add, get.
That's Joel Bennett's
Yes.
Power Mancy. I actually wrote that with him.
Yes, Joel Bennett, Power Mancy. It's pretty nice. So I went to that one, Power Mancy. Started playing with it, but made a real quick web service. Awesome. But how do I protect this? How do I prevent people from hitting it without authentication? The options for Nancy are not real great, or maybe I'm just not that smart. I couldn't figure it out super easy. So then I wound up making full circle and looking at IIS again, setting up a proxy in front of it with authentication. Yeah, kind of defeats the purpose of looking for simplicity. So what I've done was take the syntax of this and rebuilt it with the .NET class HTTP listener. And HTTP listener does support Active Directory authentication. So you can put authentication right on the end of it. So I'll show you some quick examples here. So one of my first goal with it, because I like simplicity, is to keep it as small as I can and just focus on functionality, not on like features. So I trimmed it down to just 580 lines of code. So anybody that knows a bit about PowerShell can rip it apart and find bugs and be like, this doesn't make sense, or put it back together, or understand how it works under the hood and retool it for themselves. So it is a pretty small module. It's a really small module that you should be able to parse through and figure out how the code works. But I'm going to load it in here.
Looks like you already did.
And to start, you can just call new PSWebServer. And what happens is, I'm going to stop it actually. When you call new PSWebServer by yourself, it starts listening on localhost, so you won't be able to hit it from any machine outside of your PC. On port 8000, and I'm just going to need to close that window and reopen it. And it just responds with a hello world. So it doesn't really do anything, or anything useful, I should say. Try this again. There we go. So it starts up a job running in the background with events listening. So when requests hit the server, it should pop into your prompt with a little write host. So it is kind of quirky in that, it pushes my cursor down. And I'm sure there's a better way to do that. But it starts listening at localhost 8000, and if I punch that in a web browser, I should get your internet access is blocked. It was just done. I might have jacked it up with my VPN. There we go. Technology. So it just responds with hello world. Default. There is a public switch there, and if you make it public, then it's going to be listening outside of localhost. You'll be able to hit it from your phone or whatever. To do the public switch, you do need to be running as admin, or you can reserve specific URLs to say only this process is allowed to register on this URL, and only this user is allowed to register on this URL, which IIS does for you in the background. But there's a few commands you can do if you want to run the web server as a non-admin account, which is what you would want to do in production. You would want to register whatever user you want running the script as allowed to listen on that port or on that host name externally. But when you're testing, just run it as admin with a public switch, and then you should be able to hit it from any other device when it's on public. So you can see it puts down in your console every time a little arrow and a little response. So the arrow is somebody send a request in. That was what they requested, and this was the response. It was an HTTP 200 that we sent back to the browser.
If you put the public switch, does it just resolve, I'm guessing, localhost to the PC name then for the Android?
Yeah, it will. If you do public without specifying, it will add a prefix with a plus sign,
Okay.
which just says any available host name I'm going to listen on. So it'll listen on IP address, it'll listen on the computer name, and if you happen to have any other DNS name that's hitting that or redirected to the computer, it'll listen on it. So stopping it is pretty easy. Stop PSWebServer. The third example here is a little bit more getting into it, I think. So I'm going to I want to listen and respond with 3 different things. I want to listen to GET requests just sent to the root, which is the URL. And if they request the root, I'm going to respond with just welcome to PSWebServer. If they hit process, I'm going to respond with get process, select name, convert to JSON, and get pretty process, just going to cheat and use convert to HTML and spit it out. So I can just run that code. Should be listening again. Welcome. Process. JSON. Pretty process. Save. So that's pretty simple. Right, simple to set up, simple to explain to people. You got 4 lines. Now this again is not PowerShell compliant, but this is just an alias. So you can add get handler path is what that is. And then this one is script. That. So then you can hand that off to your PowerShell people. And that's perfectly fine. And what this web schema thing is, it's just an array. So when I run that command, add get handler, path, script, all that's doing is it's sending back a little object with the path as a regular expression, the method, the script, and then an authorized groups. So it's just storing it in the array. The other way to do it is like, my sites equals an array, and my sites plus equals add to handler, and you could just add them into the array all you want, and then pass that variable to the new PSWebServer and use it that way. The reasoning behind this thing, or the way that it's spelled out there, is that looks familiar to a web developer, to more C# stuff. But it doesn't have to be that way. So let's see, and when I run new PSWebServer, it does create a global variable $PSWebServer that you can get at. So you can have multiple web servers running and access them. And this is so it gives you the URL, the engine event that's listening for that's doing write host, sending all the information to your console, and then the server job. So you can manually stop the job. And all that stop PSWebServer is, oops, if you leave this variable blank, it's just going to go get the global variable, and then it's going to get that job and stop that job. So it's a pretty simple little combination here. But where this gets useful in my actual one, it's turned out really useful case that I'm using this in production is when you want to run a PowerShell script from maybe like an unauthorized user, anonymous authenticate and run a script as maybe someone with admin credentials or something like that. So you can get add any of these from a web browser. You can make a website, you could do a GUI, but getting at it from invoke REST method in PowerShell is like super easy. So this one is, forget I'm doing nothing, but I want to start a process by an HTTP post. So I can go invoke REST method, point it at this URI, start process by post. I'm going to specify my method is post, and I'm going to give it a body here to send to the server. And anything I send in the body gets converted to $body inside the script. So if I run this, it should start PowerShell, or start Notepad. It should, but it did not. There we go. It may want me to send it in as an actual hash table. We'll try that. So it should respect the hash tables that you send and convert them to PowerShell objects on the other side, so you can dot into whatever parameters you send. But we'll see how truthful. The demo gods be with me. There we go. Yep. So it's really easy to pass parameters. So I could have this script here, which is what I'm doing right now. I have new PSWebServer running as an account with administrative privileges. Well, it's got access to add computers and move computer objects in Active Directory. So moving from 7 to 10, we have all of our Windows 7 computers in one OU, and we have all of our Windows 10 computers in a different OU, so we wanted to do different group policies between the two. So every time I upgrade a machine, I have to, when the deployment is finished, move it to the new OU. So I could write instructions for the help desk or whatever to do it in process, but I end up getting questions all the time. So I have new PSWebServer running, listening for, on a move OU URL publicly, and every time I just added a little command to my task sequence, say invoke REST method, here's the URL, move OU, here's my computer name, and when it's finished, I don't have any authentication. It's like anybody can call that. So invoke REST method, move OU, boop, hits it, moves it to the other OU, and I don't have to worry about setting up MDT web services, which is a community project done in IAS. Another huge one. And I got like 5 lines of code, so it's super easy to explain to everybody else on the team. Let's see, what else? Okay, so you can send parameters in if you're doing a post as your method in the body, but you can also, if you're doing get or a post and you want to do some parameters in your body, but different parameters in the URL, when you're writing out the path here, you can put in curly braces, anything, and those, as long as it's in curly braces, they get converted to parameters. So I should be able to go first name, last name, parameters. And then this is a get. So all I really have to do is invoke REST method, give it the URI. And if I restart, listen again. And it should return back the string. So whatever the last string is that gets returned by your script block, that's what gets sent out, whether it's a web browser or whatever. So if you are trying to serve an HTML file or something, you could type get content, the file path, that's your whole script block. And then every time they hit that URL, it's going to serve that HTML out to them as a string. But quite a few different ways to do parameters.
You had 2 kind of methods or 2 functions running on your server. Would you want that separated out by different gets, like how you had before, where you had a root and a process, or would you actually try to take care of that internal error handling, or like internal logic to direct? I don't know if it makes sense.
I think so. It depends on what you're wanting to do. From web development standards, every path is supposed to be like a different method. So you're supposed to separate them logically depending on what you're wanting to do. The standards are really similar to like PowerShell naming standards, except super trimmed down. So get would be the verb, and then noun would be your path.
Okay.
But they only have get, post, patch, options. They got like 7 or 8 different methods, and then have a lot of different paths. And then your parameters are supposed to be in the body.
So like if you had like 2, say, we'll go to OU, so you have one that's like move from this OU to this OU, and the other one delete this from. So you probably have one that says like process by, pass through, whatever, slash move and then process by slash delete or something. So it'd be kind of like that. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, couldn't you just support different verbs to the same path?
Mm-hmm. Yep, you could do. Yeah, the idea is you're never supposed to do anything when someone does an HTTP GET. That's like GET process is not supposed to delete processes.
Okay.
So what you want to do is, there is one called delete. So you want to add a delete handler, and then that one is a little bit more like you're telling whoever's consuming your API, a delete is going to delete something. So be careful.
Okay.
And post is supposed to be like appending, and then put is like creating something new or replacing what exists. So there's definitely nothing stopping you from creating like get / process and accepting a name, and then when you call invoke web request, you give it the URI and the process name, and then in your script you're actually killing the process. Nothing stopping you from doing that, but it's going to confuse the talker if it's trying to use it later. So this one I was going to show you here. How you might build a user interface around the script that you want to run. So this one, it's pretty simple. I'm going to just take whatever body they're sending me in the post, and I want to convert it to HTML and send it back to them. So listening. So then you want to build a user interface. You go out, you Google W3 schools, HTML form for post. And there's HTML form. They got a little sample here. And you see they got method right in here. So what I did was I took this little method, or I copied this code, put it into a little HTML file, and then change the action to the URL where PowerShell is listening, and change the method to post. And the name here is what's going to get sent to the server as the parameter name, and then the value is whatever I type in. So I should, now that I got the server running, be able to run it. Got a little form. Hit the submit button, and you can see those got sent over parameter, got translated into the body object there. So making a user interface, you can either serve up the HTML, that's fine, from the actual server, but you don't need to use that. You don't need to use it. You could just save an HTML file in a network share and tell them to open it in the browser. And as long as you're sending information to the right URL, then it should come back fine. Now, if you're doing more advanced development stuff, you might run into sending information to something that has a different URL than what they're on. Browsers typically frown upon that unless it's actually going to take you to that new URL. But you can see here it actually took me. If you're just using a regular form, it's going to always take you. So making forms is super easy. And then you can take any JavaScript framework, any CSS. Thanks for coming. Yeah, sorry. It was good seeing you. You can take any CSS framework or whatever and make it look all pretty in a couple of seconds. What else? Yeah, so authentication. This is a big win. for me anyway. Every one of these, so there is because I ran it, I didn't import it. So there's adding a delete handler, adding a get handler, adding a post, and adding a put. I don't support, or I don't have support for all of the HTTP verbs in there yet, but every one of them has parameter authorized groups, and that's an array of strings. And those strings can either be, well, any group that you want to be authorized. So users and administrators, those are both just local groups on the PC, but this is a domain joined machine, so I could put in any of our domain groups and it would be fine. If I hit it from Internet Explorer, and I'm using this authentication scheme, negotiate, it should do pass-through authentication. So I'm going to get a unauthorized when I go in there as a, if I tried to run this as a non-administrator, well, let's just run it, see how it goes. So if I'm trying to do, if I'm actually trying to start a process here as a standard user, which my PowerShell is, yeah, get a 401 unauthorized. But I should be able to run process, because I'm in the standard users group. There we go. Let me do that. So adding security, or integrated security to Active Directory, super easy. And then, yeah, this is basically the little, not quite what I'm running in production because I have a little bit more logic, but basically I'm violating the standards by doing something when they're calling a get, but I just wanted this simplicity of just invoke a URI. So I'm listening publicly on the computer names host at 8001, and then all I have to do from my task sequence is invoke REST method, give it the URI, with this. And that's really all I have to do to get it to move. So it's a simple run. So you do have to be cautious. You can see, I mean, once you're getting into this, you can see how web applications are impossible to secure, because web applications are really all about letting people do stuff with limited, super limited security, or you don't want them running as your credentials. If you set this up and you just somehow were executing whatever parameters they sent, then they can feed code in and run code as your admin account.
Well, what about doing some kind of like OAuth type? I don't know. I'm thinking like a token-based authentication. You know what I mean? You could pass a token over in the header and then, you know what I mean, only execute the script if, you know what I mean, it has this token or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could do that if you didn't want, if you didn't want Active Directory security, you could do that, but even if you're doing it that way, you can see it's easy to sink yourself into a hole if you don't write your script quite right, like allow escaping or whatever. I mean, that's how a lot of different web apps get compromised, is doing escape characters, and they break out of their parameter and the server starts executing whatever code.
Oh, like an injection kind of on,
yeah, that's
on
what
token?
That's what happens with, like, I was working through this and I started to understand a little bit more about how all of these attacks work, because, I mean, this is written in PowerShell, but servers written in that are executing PHP as someone accidentally is running a server as root or something like that, and then they allowed, you know, they're doing something crazy like, yeah, whatever comes in as body, I'm just gonna and execute it because, you know, I made my form say process name.
Yeah, but then whatever you pass in as a parameter, it's just gonna run.
And someone who's familiar with technology pops up in PowerShell and overwrites method, starts a really long command.
Well, like the way the GitHub API works, you authenticate the first time, and you do that sending credentials, and you know, you pass an actual credential object, so you got a username and a secure string, and then that returns back a unique API token, and it would be different. I guess you could. I don't know if you can actually move that API token around from computer to computer, but so you basically register. You register, and then if you go into your profile, you'll see like any computer you've ever registered to GitHub with, you'll see your tokens in there from every computer. So you get that token back, and then every time you make a request via a REST method, you pass that token, but you don't pass it in the body, you pass it in the header. So you'd have to, you know what I mean? And then if that authentication doesn't go through, nothing else will execute.
Right.
So I was almost thinking you could have a little front end like that. So rather than, I mean, you would still use Active Directory to authenticate to give you a token back. You know what I mean? And then you'd be securing the token on the server. So then every subsequent request you make, you have that token. And then like with the gist module I use, I store that token in your Windows credential store. So then every time you make a request, it just goes and retrieves it, and then it disposes it. But something like that for security, I'm just kind of, I don't know.
Yeah. The idea of this is it handles all that for you.
Yeah, I guess with Active Directory authentication, I guess there'd be no point in that.
Because I was looking at doing some of that for Nancy, because basically what you'd have to do. And there's modules out there
Yeah, but
for
with that,
handling all of that.
yeah, with the Active Directory, there's no point because something like GitHub, you don't have Active Directory, so you just got credentials sitting out on their server, and then that's how you're authenticating.
Yeah.
You don't have a way to pass that through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this way you don't have to worry about any of that.
Right.
Because you're just working off of their own Active Directory.
I guess in my head the whole time I was thinking of a way like to be able to run as my normal account, but when I want to do an administrative thing, pass a credential object with it. You know what I mean? So you would say invoke web requests, blah, 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 here, use my admin credential or something. To do, you know what I mean? To do that.
Yeah, so it's actually doing that for you because you're not, the code that gets executed in here, it's not running using impersonation. It's running as whoever
It's running the service.
started the server.
Yeah, but no, I'm more thinking like it would even get passed into the script log.
Yeah, so that's actually the best practice of what you would want to do, is you would want your server to be running as the lowest possible access ever.
Right.
Like you only want it to just be able to run as a batch job
Right.
and listen on that server. And then you would take all of your credentials and either store them on the server's credential store or store them local as encrypted. And then that user that like in your script block here, you would, every time you get a request, import the credential and run the script.
Right, using that credential.
Run another script using that credential. And then you don't have to worry about distributing the credential or managing it anywhere because it's just sitting on the server. But I'm lazier than that. I just run it as a user that has permissions to do what I want, which is kind of risky because if they somehow break out of the script that I've defined and my expected scenarios, then they could run whatever they want as that particular user, which is where you get into trouble with most web applications.
Right. It'd be possible to, so if you passed it like a get credentials object, could you then just pass it a credential like that?
And keep passing it through?
The other end authenticate?
Yeah, you wouldn't need to authenticate at the other end. You would just have your server do whatever you need.
Yeah, say, for instance, say you weren't on AD. Could you pass it a credential object and then on the other end just say, set up your authentication on that end?
It'd be like IIS authentication, I guess, at that point.
Yes, that's what it, yeah, that's what it does under that's what the little authorized groups is it? I mean, this is your authentication method or scheme that you accept.
So you could say prompt, right? And then every time you ran an arrest request, whatever a REST method, you would have to authenticate. Like, because is it prompt one too? Like where you actually get a dialogue? Isn't that an authentication method for IIS?
I think that's basic.
Basic, yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, and then their user ID and password that they send in become parameters that you can use in your script. Yeah, whatever they send you. But if you have Active Directory, you can just do what I did, which is use default credentials or pop up on Internet Explorer and it just sends it through.
See, I'm almost thinking like, so you would pass in your own admin credential. So I'd be running as a standard user, right? I'd pass in my own admin credential to whatever method I'm trying to invoke, right? The web server is running as the absolute lowest, lowest, it's not doing anything, and then into the actual script block it runs, it passes that credential in and does, you know what I mean? It's basically running everything as that. And actually in that script block you could do PS remoting, and then you could essentially turn PS remoting off in your entire organization with the exception, you know what I mean? You could set up your win or run listeners to only come from this web server.
Yeah. Yeah, that, the net, or the HTTP listener actually supports that method. It's called impersonation.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have to do it using Active Directory. You can't do it using basic authentication.
Sure, yeah, because you'd be hopping at that point.
Yeah, but what happens when you request credentials, negotiate, the browser or PowerShell or whatever actually sends like your whole Active Directory object of like, here's my SID, here's all the groups that I'm a member of, here's, here's everything you need to become me.
Right.
And then on the server side, you type impersonate, and here's the identity object that was passed. Everything I do at that point is completely as if I were you.
See, that'd be cool though, because it would put one central node, like, it'd almost be like a WinRM or PS remoting proxy. You know what I mean? Like, okay, WinRM is on, but only if the source IP is this web server, and that's it. It's almost the same concept as GIA, really. That just enough administration.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to do. It's just enough administration, but also be able to wrap a UI around it.
Yeah, and the GIA is more, this controls what commands you can see even. Like, right. So you can say, yeah, you're not an administrator on this DNS server, but you can go, you know, create and clear DNS records because I'm exposing the commandlet to you. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's all that does. It's not like oh, you hit this REST method and it does something. It's more just you can see this, you can't see this.
Yeah, which, if you, really from a web development standpoint, if you're running an IIS or you're running like in a Linux environment or whatever, no matter what web server you build, you always run the risk of them breaking out of your environment, and then they have access to every, if they get shell, or if they're running scripts in your environment under the credentials that you're running as, it could do some damage. Even if you have a lower level credential, they might be able to do credential escalation through some vulnerability or whatever. But if you're running a web server that's running PowerShell, and your web server is running from inside a GIA, or just enough administration endpoint, even if they break out, they would only have the options that you allowed inside of there. So you'd be like one of the most locked down web applications you can make.
Sounds complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know even how hard it would be to make this work inside of a just enough administration endpoint. But
yeah, because you'd have to trace down every command you're running from within in your module to make the web server itself run. You know what I mean? All those would have to be allowed.
Yeah, you'd have to, I think you'd have to allow the .NET class.
And I've never messed with GIA to know what its scoping truly is and what, you know what I mean? I don't know if you just go, yeah, DNS admins can have *-DNS star, you know, I don't know. I know the concept, I just don't know. I've never done it.
It would be sweet. But that's like a whole new possibility, because I don't know of anything like that for IIS, of like completely locking down IIS to these classes are the only thing that anything done through this web endpoint is allowed to use. Anyway. Oh, one other demo here, because I got lots of ideas. That was kind of fun. Okay, so I have my web schema made up of 3 paths here. The root, which returns a relatively small HTML page. It's using jQuery and this awesome JavaScript library called jQuery Terminal for terminal emulation. And then I have a command path that I'm listening on that is really potentially bad if I open that up to anybody, but it's just executing whatever comes in as a command in the body, whatever's sent via the HTTP post, and then whatever the result is, I'm just outstringing it. And then I have another one for prompt, which returns the value of whatever's executed by prompt. So something with the HTTP listener object, when you tell it to wait for a query or whatever, it like hangs the entire shell until something hits that URL. So running in a job, it won't exit the job until something hits that URI. So my jury-rig way around it right now is inside of the commandlet there, I wait 2 seconds and then I do invoke REST method to whatever the URI is to kind of flush it out and then stop it. But sometimes it hits. So anyway, pretty simple code right there. Listening on port 8080. The really nice thing about this is actually I spent a lot of time doing error handling because making stuff is the hardest part and debugging is the hardest part. So if anything inside of your script hits an error, it will return an HTTP 500. So whatever app you're using or whatever JavaScript, it will recognize that it's coming to the browser as an error. And then if it's a post, it will send it back as a string like this, formatted so it's kind of like a regular PowerShell standard error. So you kind of get the feel of what went wrong. But if you do a HTTP GET, it will send you back your entire error with a stack trace in JSON formatted so you can expand out and go into all of your debugging to figure out what happened in your script, because since the server's running inside of the job, it's kind of hard to figure out what went wrong. But this way the errors just get sent to your browser or right back to invoke REST method as the error right there. So it's pretty easy to debug.
It's pretty sad that this is the same exact concept of the terminal inside VS Code, and this looks 150 times more responsive.
Yeah.
No, seriously though, this is the same exact way that that your terminal is running in VS Code. It's the same thing.
Yeah, this one's pretty basic, so sure. It doesn't support tab completion. So I'm sure if I put in tab completion, it would slow it down.
Yeah, but it doesn't support, like PS Readline and stuff isn't supported in the current terminal in VS Code right now.
Call and get credential, something that requires a UI.
Right. Looks
like it hung. I don't know. If I wanted to continue, which this is a little bit, would be a fun little hobby horse to tinker with for a while, to see how much support I could get into it. But right now it's just a really dumb kind of fun.
That's still pretty cool though on a web browser.
Yeah. And I did at home the other night, I did a public switch and then popped it open on my home network from my iPhone. Shelling away.
So what you're running here, it's running on the server then? Like on your little
Yeah, that's what so his handler is basically anything that comes in, execute as a script block.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's kind of like an and every command you send. And ampersand.
Yeah. You know all my 80 scripts that don't work because I'm not going to upload my 80 module?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do it.
Run a little PSWebServer and then I'll run all 80 on it.
You can also just
Yeah.
put the AD
Just
module on a UNC pad and say
put some
import module
authentication
UNC
on it.
pad.
Because you don't want just anybody to be deleting computers. Yeah. So the link to this I'll put in the Slack chat. I've been updating the gist periodically, but I'll make it into a Git repo. So if you guys have any ideas on it or you want to chip in, like I said, some ideas actually for later. or some things that I may want help on, or stuff to work on. So right now, one might be impersonation, like you said. But HTTPS support, the HTTP listener class does support certificates and all that, but I'm not sure how it would work. So I need to work through that to get it supported and maybe document it. But I really want to keep the actual server part down to just this for functionality. And then I want to work out some way to do extensibility and plugins. So if you don't want any logging, you can just run it like this and trust that it's safe and secure, because it's only 400 lines of code and I can read through it myself, and yeah, it's not going to jack anything up. But if I want logging, I want to be able to do like dash plugin IIS style log or something like that. And then every HTTP request that comes in gets logged out to a file in the same format as IIS logs. So I want to work out some sort of a system where you can add stuff on to the base of it. And then working on the base, I'd like to improve the debugging and development experience. I mean, exporting everything to your shell is kind of handy. Like, if I do send an error message, the entire error gets dropped out here. But adding things to your web schema, I have to stop the server and I have to restart it. I can't add dynamically.
Yeah, that's a limitation of Flancy too.
To the web server.
PowerMancy supports that. You could dig that apart and see how he does that.
Yeah, I was thinking run spaces and shared variable. Because it's, I mean, the web schema is just an array, right? And
yeah, so you could add a new run space for every path?
Yeah, that could actually...
I guess that could get out of control as well, but...
Yeah, so the PSWebServer module out there also uses HTTP listener, and HTTP listener supports multi-threading. Like, it can listen, one class with one prefix can listen on several different threads and respond on several different threads. So it's performant. And the way he does it is he says get context, which is, hey, listen on the URL. He runs get context in 4 different jobs. So you could run a job for every URL, or you could do a new run space for every path, but then management of that becomes so it's like, do I want high performance or do I want simplicity? And the kind of direction I want to go with this is just keep it as simple as possible. I even debated not putting it into a job and keeping it thread blocking, because that's just simple. But I think the debugging experience of being able to do invoke REST method against it sitting in another job kind of outweighed. And it was like 3 lines of extra code. So that's kind of what I'm working towards. It's still kind of obviously buggy, but it's fun to tinker with. And for right now, doing simple stuff like, yeah, one script that you wanted to run on occasion is pretty simple. Put it up there. And you can do, this is my logging, because I didn't even have logging in there. And then someone was like, hey, your script is moving computers to all different kinds of OUs. What? No, it's like, no, it doesn't even do that. It just puts it to this one. Like, I don't care. So after having that debate, I was like, okay, I better put in a log to say every time it moves a computer, or every time something hits a request, I'm gonna add something to a file about which computer I moved to where. So you can add in logging so you have a record of, nope, wasn't me. But it would be kind of nice to have some standardized logging. I mean, you could do start transcript.